There are souls who walk through childhood carrying more than their small hearts should hold. They are not louder than the rest, not more talented by the world's standards, but they feel more. They see what others pass by. They ache in places no one speaks of. These are the ones marked early, not with crowns or applause, but with silence, with questions too big for their age, with pain that carved deep wells within them. You may have been one of them, the child who stood on the edges, sensing a world beyond what eyes could see, the one who didn't quite fit, who carried dreams no one understood, who often felt like a stranger in their own home, and yet there was something sacred in you even then. A quiet light, flickering, unexplainable but steady. From the very beginning you were set apart, chosen for ease, but for depth, for a calling that cannot be rushed, only revealed. This is not about titles or platforms. It is about purpose. A purpose planted before your first breath. The world may have tried to cover it with shame or doubt, but it cannot be erased. In this gentle space, you will hear the signs, the early signs that God's hand was on you, even in the smallest moments of your childhood. Not to explain away the pain, but to help you see it through the lens of grace. These signs will not shout. They will feel like remembering something your spirit always knew. You were never forgotten. You were never abandoned. You were seen. You were loved. You were chosen. Before the world named you, he did, and he called you his. Some children grow up surrounded by laughter, constant chatter, and crowded rooms. Others, though, find themselves walking quieter paths. They sit by windows for long hours, not out of loneliness, but out of a deep and quiet, knowing that something holy lives in the silence. These are the ones who carry solitude not as a burden, but almost as a gift. Even in their earliest years, they felt a pull not toward noise or crowds, but toward stillness. There were moments when you sat alone while others ran and played, but inside you were not empty. There was a fullness there, a presence that stayed close. It was not loud. It didn't speak in ways the world understands, but you felt it, a warmth, a whisper in the quiet, something unseen that wrapped around your soul like soft light. Others may have seen you as withdrawn or different, but your spirit was simply drawn to the deeper places. You were not hiding, you were listening. Some children are watched over by angels in ways that cannot be explained. They grow up with a sense that someone is always near, even when no one is in the room. At night, when fears tried to rise, there was often a calm that followed, a gentle peace that settled in the chest. It didn't remove all the fear, but it kept it from taking over. This is the nearness of God. His Spirit does not wait until we are grown to begin his work. He speaks to the hearts of children, especially those he has set apart. You may have looked at the sky and felt a longing that had no words. You may have talked to the air, not because you were pretending, but because something in you knew someone was listening. When others ran from silence, you felt drawn into it. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was never truly empty. There is a reason for this. The ones God chooses often walk quiet paths in their youth, not as punishment, but as preparation. Solitude becomes the soil where faith first begins to grow. God often meets us in places where others do not see value, in the silence, in the shadows, in the slow hours of waiting. When you were a child, sitting alone, watching the wind move through trees, listening to your own breath, there was more happening than you knew. The Spirit was near. He was shaping your heart to hear him. He was teaching you how to be still in a world that moves too fast. He was building in you a refuge so that later, when storms would come, you would know where to go. Aloneness is not the same as abandonment. Some of the most anointed lives begin in quiet rooms with no audience, no noise, and no applause. It is there that God begins his deepest work. It is there that he speaks in ways that only the soul can hear. From your earliest days, you were never truly alone. Even when no one sat beside you, someone was holding your life with care. And the silence that once felt so heavy now bears witness it was never empty. It was sacred. There are children who do not stay children long in their thoughts. While their hands are still small and their voices still soft, their minds begin to wander into places most adults avoid. They ask questions that silence rooms, questions too heavy for their years, not out of rebellion, not to challenge, but because something in them is already reaching for the eternal. You may have been that child, sitting quietly in the corner wondering why some people hurt and others don't, why good people leave too soon, why the world feels broken in places no one talks about. You may have looked at someone smiling and still felt their sadness underneath. And then, somewhere deep in your heart, a question would rise: why does it have to be this way? Most would say you were too young to be thinking like that. They would smile and change the subject, trying to guide your mind back to toys and games. But the ache in you did not leave. The questions would return at night, when the world grew still and the noise faded away. You didn't have the words for it then, but you were already searching for God. The chosen often begin their search early. Before they know his name, they know his absence. Before they hear his voice, they feel the silence. There is something holy in this ache, something sacred in the questions that rise without answers. God is not afraid of them. In fact, he plants many of them himself, questions that stir the heart awake, questions that break the surface of shallow living and pull the soul toward deeper waters. Even as a child, you may have wrestled with ideas too vast to hold life, death, heaven, justice, love that leaves, pain that stays. You may have asked someone close to you, "Where is God?" and received only a shrug or a well-meaning phrase. But the question lingered. It followed you. It lived with you. Not to torment, but to invite. Every question was a doorway. Every ache was an opening. The Spirit was already near, drawing you closer to the one who never turns away from seeking hearts. Children like you are often misunderstood. Too quiet, too intense, too serious. But God looks at such hearts and sees treasure. He knows the weight they carry and the beauty they will one day reveal. The world teaches children to forget their questions, to bury them beneath distractions. But chosen ones rarely can. Their questions are seeds. They grow slowly, but they grow deep. In the quiet spaces where those questions once lived, God begins to speak. Not always in answers, but in presence. Not always in explanations, in comfort. And what once felt like confusion becomes a kind of worship, the kind that does not need to understand everything, only to trust that he is near. You were not strange for asking what others ignored. You were not too much. You were being called, even then. Even in your wondering, the questions did not distance you from God, they were your first prayers. And he heard every one. Some children carry more sorrow than their shoulders should bear. While others laugh freely, some learn to swallow tears before they can fall. The ones marked by God are often touched early by grief, by separation, by the sting of injustice. There is no clear reason for it, no explanation that makes it feel lighter, but still, it happens, and it leaves a mark that time alone cannot erase. You may have known what it felt like to be left out, to be chosen last, or not at all. You may have learned how to be strong, not because you wanted to, but because there was no one else to be strong for you. Perhaps someone you loved left too soon, or broke what they were meant to protect. Perhaps words were spoken that wounded more deeply than any bruise. And still, you moved forward, quietly, slowly, with pieces of yourself hidden away, unsure if they would ever feel safe again. Many will say childhood should be a time of lightness, of safety, and they are right. But for those set apart by heaven, the road is often different. Pain arrives early not to punish, but to prepare. God never wills suffering, but he weaves purpose through it. The enemy tries to break what God is building, but grace surrounds even the smallest child. And though you walk through shadows, you are never abandoned. Some wounds don't show on the outside, they live in silence. In the way a child learns not to speak when it matters, in the way the eyes stop meeting others, or the laughter becomes something practiced. These are signs of the battle that began before you understood its name, and yet you endured, not because you were stronger than others, but because someone was holding you together, even when it felt like you were falling apart. The ones God chooses are often misunderstood in their early years. Their hearts break easily, not because they are weak, but because they were made to carry compassion. They are called to weep with those who weep. And so, they must first know what it means to weep alone. They are called to speak words of healing, and so they must first learn how silence feels. The sorrow of youth becomes the oil of gladness, poured out in time. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers. David was left in the fields, forgotten by his father. Esther was orphaned. Moses was hidden in a basket and raised among strangers. Each one was touched by hardship before destiny called their name. So were you, not because God was distant, but because he was near, forming something eternal in you, a strength that doesn't harden, a wisdom that doesn't boast, a tenderness that heals. What happened to you was not fair, and God does not ask you to pretend it was. He does not dismiss your pain. He holds it. He remembers every tear. And in the mystery of his mercy, he begins to redeem what was lost, not by erasing your story, but by filling it with his presence. What tried to crush you has become the soil for something sacred. You are still here, and that alone is evidence of his hand. As the years pass, there are children whose hearts do not rest with the things of this world. While others chase fleeting joys, there is a quiet longing in some souls that points them towards something they cannot see but know is there. It is as if they have always known there is more, a deeper realm, just beyond the veil of what the eye can see, a world that is not made of flesh but of spirit, a truth that cannot be touched, yet is more real than anything this earth offers. Perhaps as a child you looked at the stars and felt the weight of eternity resting in the quiet expanse above you. Maybe, when the wind whispered through the trees, you could almost hear a voice calling, a voice you couldn't name, but one you knew was always near. While others were content with what could be held, you sensed something was missing, something invisible, something sacred. The world around you was bright, full of noise and color, but your heart was drawn to silence, to the unseen, to the things that could not be held, but only felt. You could not explain it then. You could not even name it, but you knew. There was a pull, a divine invitation, calling you towards something higher, something that belonged not to this world but to another one, that could not be seen with eyes, but only with a spirit that was open and awake. Children who are chosen by God often feel this pull. Others may search for satisfaction in the things that pass away, new toys, new experiences, new distractions. But those set apart sense the eternal in all things. They see beyond the surface, beyond the noise. They feel the presence of God in the quiet spaces, in the slow movements of life. Their hearts are drawn not just to what is visible, but to what is hidden beneath, to what is holy and unseen. You may have wandered through your days, unsure of what it was you were seeking. You longed for answers, for peace, for something that made sense of all the confusion. But even in your searching, you were drawn to the stillness, to the silence. You sought moments where the noise faded, where the clamor of the world grew distant, and in those moments you could hear something more, not with your ears, but with your soul, the quiet voice that whispered through the air, through your thoughts, through the depths of your heart. This is the mark of one who is chosen, not the need to possess or control, but the longing to know, to understand, to be in the presence of what is eternal. The ones set apart often find themselves strangers to the world around them, feeling out of place, as though they are searching for a home they have not yet found. It is not that they are lost, it is that they are being led, and that leading draws them ever closer to the unseen. To the Spirit who moves in the hidden places, to the Lord who is not bound by time or space, but is present everywhere, calling quietly to the heart. The pull toward the unseen is not a sign of emptiness, but of fullness. It is not a longing for escape, but a yearning for deeper connection. Your spirit was made to resonate with the eternal. You were never meant to be satisfied with what can be held in human hands. Your heart was always meant to reach toward the one who created you. Even in your youth, you were learning to seek him, to listen for his voice, to feel his presence in the world that often seemed too loud. And though you may not have had the words to understand it then, the pull you felt was the call of God. He was not distant. He was not silent. He was simply waiting for you to listen, waiting for you to look beyond what is seen and find his presence in the unseen. There are children who speak in ways that make grown hearts pause, not because they know more, but because their words carry weight far beyond their years. It is not something taught. It is not rehearsed. It flows from a place too deep for human wisdom, an unseen well that only heaven can fill. You may have noticed it early, though you didn't understand it then. While others were still learning how to name their feelings, you somehow knew how to hold someone else's sorrow. You saw the tears others didn't show, and when you spoke, people listened, not always because they wanted advice, but because your words brought peace, gentle words, words that settled the noise inside aching hearts, words that reached past logic and found the hidden places where pain lives. This, too, is a mark of the chosen. The Spirit of God rests upon those he calls, even before they fully know him. And often that Spirit speaks through them not in loud proclamations, but in quiet comfort, in the way a child might take another's hand and say, "It's going to be okay," and somehow it feels true, not because of the words themselves, but because of the presence carried in them. Perhaps you were the one others came to without knowing why. Adults who sat beside you too long, telling you more than they meant to, friends who cried beside you without needing explanation. You felt their pain before they spoke it, and somehow you knew what to say, not to fix, not to change, but simply to stay near. That nearness, that presence, was not your own strength. It was God's compassion moving through you. There is a wisdom that doesn't come from study. It comes from walking with the one who sees all things. It is not loud or proud. It is soft, like the breath of God upon a broken spirit. Chosen children often carry this without knowing the weight of it. They don't seek to be seen. They just speak what rises in them, and what rises is often healing. In times of sorrow, you may have felt an ache that wasn't yours, a burden in your chest that came from someone else's grief, and yet you held it. Not because you had to, but because something in you could not turn away. You were not trying to be strong, you were simply being who you were, someone through whom God's comfort quietly moved. Even when your own heart was tired, you still found a way to speak kindness. Even when no one saw the weight you carried, you lifted others. That is the work of the Spirit. That is the sign of one anointed before they could name what anointing meant. Some of the most powerful voices begin in small, unnoticed places, whispers spoken through children who do not yet know they are prophets of peace. What you gave others in those moments, it mattered. The Lord saw every word, every gentle act, and even now, that gift still lives in you. It has not left. It has not faded. The same Spirit who spoke through you then still rests upon you, not because you earned it, but because you were chosen to carry it, to be a vessel for comfort in a world that forgets how to listen. And even now you are being shaped not to speak louder, but to speak deeper, not to impress, but to heal. The words planted in you long ago were never your own. They were His, and they still are. Some children walk through life with a quiet sense of difference, not a prideful difference, not a need to be seen, just a still awareness that they do not quite belong to the world around them. It lives in their chest like a whisper. It rises in the quiet and lingers through the noise. They cannot explain it, but they know. Something about them is other, set apart, marked. You may have felt it too, long before anyone gave it a name, before you heard sermons or read sacred words, before you were taught how to pray or how to listen for God. Still, the sense was there, a soft weight in your soul that told you you were not like the rest. You moved through life as though carrying a secret not even you understood. You didn't ask for it. You didn't seek it. But it was there. At times it made you feel distant. You could be surrounded by people and still feel a step removed, as if the current pulling them forward was not the one pulling you. You saw the world through a different lens. Not always clearer, but deeper. You noticed things others missed. You heard silence where others only heard noise. You felt beauty in places others walked by. You were not trying to be different, but something in you could not settle where others rested. You looked for more. You waited for something invisible, a home you had never been to, yet longed for all the same. This quiet knowing did not always bring peace. Sometimes it brought sorrow, a gentle ache that followed you, not as a wound, but as a reminder. You were not made for everything the world offered. Your heart was tuned to something higher. There were moments you could not explain, feelings that came out of nowhere, a sudden stillness in the middle of chaos, a sense of being watched over when no one was near. These were not accidents. They were traces of the Spirit, reaching toward you in the hidden places. God often speaks to those He chooses through this kind of silence, deep, wordless, and full. Others may have called you too sensitive, too quiet, too distant, but the Lord saw the quiet fire within you. He placed it there Himself. The ones He calls often carry this sense from the beginning. It is not always joyful. It is not always clear, but it is steady, and it grows. Even when you were young, you knew when something was wrong, even if no one spoke it aloud. You felt the grief in a room, the hope behind someone's eyes, the weight someone tried to hide. And even when you couldn't help, you carried it with them. That too was part of the knowing, part of the calling. You did not create this feeling. It was given. You did not earn this knowing. It was planted. The world did not understand it, but heaven did. And the same presence that held you then holds you still. What you carried in silence was not emptiness. It was the whisper of the Holy One drawing near to His own. You were not imagining it. You were not mistaken. You were being led slowly, gently toward the truth of who you really are. Chosen, watched, known. Even when no one else saw it. Even when you couldn't explain it. There are storms that pass over some and leave others unchanged. But for you, the storm did not pass. It came and stayed. It tested you when your strength was still small. It came with no warning, no mercy, and no clear way through. And yet, here you are, still breathing, still walking, still open to the sound of God's voice. This alone is a quiet miracle. There were things that touched your life far too soon. Pain that does not belong in a child's hands. Fear that wakes before the sun. Loneliness that lingers even in familiar rooms. The kind of sorrow that does not speak, but settles deep into the bones. You were too young to understand it, but not too young to feel its weight. You woke up every day with it beside you. And still, you got up. Others might never know what you endured. You may have learned to smile through it, to keep the pain hidden, tucked away behind your eyes. You didn't wear your suffering for others to see, but it followed you. And still, you carried it with grace, not because it was light, but because something greater was holding you from within. There were moments when you thought it would be the end, times when the weight felt too heavy, and you felt yourself sinking beneath it. Maybe no one saw it. Maybe no one knew. But God did. He saw you in the silence. He sat with you in the darkness. He was closer than the breath you could barely catch. When you thought you were breaking, he was building. When you thought it was over, he was writing the next page. Some of the most powerful lives are forged in fire. Not the fire of anger or pride, but the fire of quiet endurance. The flame that refines without destroying. You walked through that fire, and though it left its mark, it did not consume you. The pain shaped you, but it did not define you. You were being prepared, not punished. God allows no suffering to be wasted. What should have broken you became the place where he proved himself faithful, where his mercy held you together when nothing else could. You were not kept safe from the storm, but you were kept through it. And that is the mark of the chosen, not the absence of hardship, but the presence of grace in the midst of it. There is strength in you now that no one can see, strength formed in silence, tested in shadows, a quiet resilience that comes only from walking with God through the hardest places. You may still feel the ache of what happened, the loss, the betrayal, the absence, but even in that pain there is a deeper truth. You were never alone. You are still here, and that matters. Not because you are unshaken, but because you are still willing to hope, still willing to believe, still willing to be soft when life tried to make you hard. That is holy. That is beautiful. That is evidence of the hand of God. You survived what should have shattered you, and now the cracks in your story let the light through, not to prove your strength, but to reveal His. There is a thread running through your life, even from the earliest days, a thread woven by hands unseen, steady and kind. Though the world may have called you strange, quiet, too soft or too deep, heaven called you chosen, and that is a name no sorrow can erase. Every tear, every question, every silent ache has not gone unnoticed. You were not forgotten. You were not overlooked. The signs were always there, even when you couldn't see them. In your solitude, he was near. In your pain, he was preparing. In your questions, he was whispering, "You are mine." You did not miss your calling. You have not fallen behind. The same hand that carried you through every shadow is still guiding you now, gently, patiently, with eternal love. You were chosen, not because you were perfect, but because He is, and He delights in choosing the hidden, the quiet, the ones who walk slowly but carry deep wells of compassion and light. That light still lives in you. If this message spoke to something tender in your spirit, we invite you to gently support this space. You can do so by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue sharing reflections for hearts that long for more. Peace be with you, and may you walk forward knowing you have always been held